I'd like to talk about being for a little bit, and what role this dropping into being plays in spiritual seeking, and also maybe clarify why in this teaching, or if we look at different teachings within non-duality, they seem to talk about the identity being different in teachings. So here often there is reference to I am the person, Roger is a person. And then at other times within this teaching, much less frequently, sometimes I throw in the idea that what we are is that which witnesses everything that happens, that what I am is not the body. What I am are not the thoughts and not the emotions, but that which is aware of them after they arise. That I am the formless awareness, aware of thoughts as an object and emotions as an object only after they arise. So I've used the example of if someone is holding some flowers, a bunch of flowers behind their back, and then they bring the flowers out and hold them in front of them or in front of you, there is awareness of the flowers only after they are brought into the picture. And then the awareness is aware of what comes into the picture. And in the same way, thoughts arise, and after they have arisen into manifestation, then awareness can know the thought. And when I say after, it's maybe even simultaneous too. But the point is that until the object has come into existence, there isn't awareness of it. And so to see that you are that which is aware of the new objects that take the place of the old objects can help us understand that we are not the ones creating what is in the manifestation, but rather we are that which is aware, almost like the audience, of what is coming into existence and then being replaced by the new existence that is happening moment after moment after moment. So how can, on the one hand, we be the person, and on the other hand, that which is aware of everything that comes and goes? And as I said, often in this teaching, the emphasis is on we are the human being, but we are not the doers. We are the human being. However, the human being on a biological and psychological level is made, the human being on a biological and psychological level is a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. Two factors that we've never been in control of. Two factors that life has put in place. So we are the human being. However, on a biological and psychological level, the human being is not in control of their design and therefore not in control of the speaking, not in control of what thoughts happen next. So what is controlling the speaking and the thoughts is the biological instrument and the psychological instrument as it interacts with the circumstance that it finds itself in. And so we may, have some issue with, so if the body and the thoughts are a result of the biological instrument, essentially a biological robot, a machine, then how can I be that? if it becomes clear that all of those movements, the speaking, the thinking, the emotions, are expressions or outputs, results of the functioning of the biological machine, then if it's automatic, how can I be that? And in fact, I'm suggesting we are the human being, and the human being is in part that mechanical instrument. And then I would also say what you are is the awareness that is aware of the thoughts, the emotions, the body moving, the physical sensations, the pleasures and the pains, the preferences. You are that awareness, that consciousness that witnesses everything that comes and goes in the flow of life, including the movement of the body, the speaking. And so from that perspective, we can see that life is a happening, that speaking is happening, thinking is happening, biological feelings of hunger and tiredness, irritation are happening, excitement. Life is happening, which really means that this suggestion life is happening is I'm not doing it, but it is happening. And at the same time, so that's from the witnessing point of view, or from the awareness of everything that is arising in the moment, everything that is happening in the experience of life. So the spiritual seeking process is often a process of deconstructing the whole into pieces so that the pieces can become seen and can be known and understood and experienced in ways that they may not have been when the whole was referred to as a whole and the bits, the components weren't looked at. And so if we're talking about awareness, which might turn out to be a component of the whole, but when we're looking at awareness, we might we single it out and single it out from being the whole, a bit like a tree with its fruit. If we are looking at the fruit, we say it's not the tree. Whereas at another time, we will say the fruit is part of the tree. The fruit is not separate from the tree. The tree includes the fruit. And if you took the fruit away, the tree wouldn't be complete. And then if we are focusing on the leaves, we would describe the leaves, and we have a word for it. So leaves, and it's the thin green object, and there are many of them. So we're sort of focusing in on that, and then we'll say it's not it's the leaf, not the tree as a whole, not the bark or the branches or the fruit, just the leaves. And that describing it separately and focusing in on it, in a way, creates a conceptual distinction, means conceptually separates it. And then we can think about it separate from, which means we can look at it, we can investigate it. And that doesn't have to remain just conceptual. We can look at it in practice. So we can start looking at the leaf and feeling it and smelling it and tasting it and hearing it and looking at it. And so the concepts can point us to really get an experiential feel of an understanding of the leaf. And so when the spiritual teaching talks about awareness, the words are descriptions. So it's saying awareness is not the form. Awareness is not something that comes and goes. Awareness doesn't change. Awareness is formless, which is why it might be hard to bump into. So all of these descriptions are there to help us knowing it. So we start off with the description, and then it's like, oh, I get it. Oh, I know it. It's like pointing at the leaf and, saying it's the green thing, but then the fruit might be green also. And so then, oh, it's not round, it's flat. And so by having that distinction, we go, okay, so it's not that, which let's say is the fruit, it's that, it's the leaf. And so then we go, okay, I know it, I see it. And so now it's a direct interaction of perception with the leaf. And so in the same way, when the teachings are talking about awareness and describing it, it's pointing at awareness in the present moment. And then we might bump into it, and then it's like, oh, now I can rest there, I can feel it, I can know it intimately. So the concepts aren't so important. Then it's about the experience when we bump into it taking over, and we can become more familiar with it that way. And as part of the process of describing it, and part of the process of us coming in contact with it, we essentially might ignore the rest of what's actually there, because the process is about coming to know that bit, that component. And if we find that that's a really significant component of the human being that was unappreciated for a long time, and then we bump into it, we might actually go, oh, this is what I am. And then, because we've always been that, it's always been a significant part of the human being, it's been underappreciated, it's been unknown in a sense, although it's what we have always been. And so then it's like, this is my true nature. This is, and then the body might be sort of turned into, oh, I'm not that. And that's useful for a while. It's actually encouraged. The teachings will say you are not that, in order for a remaining in awareness, a remaining as formless awareness to happen, maybe for years, so that a familiarity, a grooving into being able to drop into awareness happens easily, more and more easily. So it becomes sort of like home, first nature, where it's available at any time. And then at some point, maybe the teachings need to say, well, you are not just awareness, but the body is also part of what you are. And we might reject that for a while. It's like, no. How I've come to know myself is by realizing I am not that. Which then hopefully the teaching gets to convince you that, yep, that was the methodology that was needed in order to bring attention onto this underappreciated but very important aspect of oneself. And so certain things needed to be said to bypass the power of belief and the identification with form. Certain things needed to be said to create this awakening to that aspect of ourself. And so really I would say, okay, so in the end, or at a certain point of the process, as the process moves on, we might have gone through a phase where we experience ourselves. So I'm not saying we're just, it's all in our head. The experience actually changes because of the influence of the teachings on the brain, and how the brain has, and awareness has been directed to a certain part of the experience. And so then that part of the experience sort of becomes the predominant feature of the experience, which means the overall experience, our daily life experience, or waking state experience, can change quality a little bit, such, or even a lot, such that there is this sort of direct sense in the experience that I am not the body. And so when someone puts forward that statement, I don't doubt at all that their experience is directly revealing that, or that the experience is that statement is coming from an experiential. I don't want to say knowing, because the my whole point is that that's not really the truth. But it's an experiential knowing of that aspect of the human being, meaning there's direct contact with that aspect of the human being. However, in that experience, it feels like that is what we are, that we are not really the body. And so my point is that when someone says, I know directly, it's not a concept, that I am formless awareness, I have no doubt that it is an experiential, or that statement is a consequence of them actually having the experiential sense of that. What I also know is it's very easy for us to fall into the trap of, because I experience it, it is truth. And because it's experienced in a way that is very different from before, where certain relative functions have fallen away, that sort of goes, oh, this is so much more true than the experience I had before. And so the concept is, I am formless awareness, and that is the truth, and that is not going to change, and that is reality, and what was there before was illusion. And I'm pretty certain that if the teachings and the process continue working, that insistence, and by that experience as well, that state, that sense. And I'm not talking about a state or an experience that lasts for 3 hours or 3 days. I'm talking about a state of knowing oneself as formless awareness that can set in for years, and it will remain for the rest of one's life if the working mind doesn't actually receive new information that starts to get it to question. And that questioning might not really be what we want, because we can feel convinced, oh, now this, what has revealed itself, is the knowing of the truth. However, life will probably deliver an insistence, in a way, will repeatedly expose you to, hey, that's not it, for example. And you want to say, yeah, that's just your opinion. And then another person or another teaching, another thing will appear that says it's not that don't try and transcend being human. It's about, and however it describes it. And so at a certain point, life will sort of impose a questioning where you say, well, how come life this alternate view to what has set in and what seems like it's the truth and reality and self-realization and knowing myself as formless awareness, which is what all the teachings prior to that point were pointing at. And so this has happened, and this must be it. And then we start getting bombarded in a way with, hey, maybe there's more. And if that happens, then our thinking and our beliefs will get shifted, because funnily enough, our critical thinking capacity in seeking, if it's not very strong, we're prone to make some fairly understandable but off the mark conclusions, because the faculty of critical thinking, which is a faculty that hasn't been developed in humans as a general rule, has allowed the errors to be made. And as critical thinking starts becoming a stronger feature that we have, then we'll start to see that, hey, certain things present in the moment don't necessarily prove what we thought they proved. We thought that that proves that because our thinking sort of left out some other potentialities, which is really a form of a lack of critical thinking. And then life starts saying, hey, what about this? Have you considered this? And as you consider that, the new bit of information, we realize that maybe we jumped to some fairly irrational decisions, or not decisions, irrational conclusions about what, let's say, that state, or what grounding into the awareness aspect proved about who I am. An example of this is that the teachings will tell us that, awareness is not born and will never die. It's ever present. It's unchanging. It's eternal. It was there before the body and will be there after the body. And so when we bump into it, it has a sense of all of those things, because it's essentially the component of the human being that isn't in the temporal dimension. It's the component of the human being that I sometimes refer to as the quantum component of the human being. And so on the quantum level, time and space and form don't exist. And so, of course, when we feel this formless awareness aspect, the consciousness aspect of the human, it's like, oh, there's no time in that, when we're grounded in that dimension of ourselves. And so, because there's no time, no sense of time, there's no sense of change. And there is a sense when we remember the descriptions, it was never born and will never die, and goes, of course, this is it. And it will never die. It was never born. It was ever present. Because there is that sense in it, because it's outside of the temporal dimension. And that can become a belief because of how it feels, and because teachings that we trusted, and we should trust them, they're profound. So I'm not saying that the teaching is leading you astray. The teachings are doing their job, and in an amazing way, teachings that have proved to be able to dismantle deeply ingrained false sense of self, are amazing. And so this error, this belief that what I am will never die, for example, or was never born, existed prior to and exists prior to the manifestation. All of these beliefs, which I'm suggesting they are put in place because of a combination of factors, including our lack of critical thinking as humans, generally hasn't been developed very well. And a lack of critical thinking means we have a lot of thinking biases. That's essentially what exists when critical thinking isn't very developed. We will sort of grab hold of a statement or a concept that sounds good to us, that confirms our sense of how we would like life to be. And so if we hear something like that, we say, yes, that's the truth. And that's called a confirmation bias. And there's many other biases, something like 100 and, over 100 biases have been identified that are ways that our thinking thinks badly, essentially, while not realizing that it's thinking badly, which is why it's so sneaky, because the confirmation biases is bad thinking, and yet it seems like very good thinking. And so one of the biases would be, we get a statement that we have taken to be truth because it comes from a trusted source. And then we have an experience that sort of we think confirms that statement. And so the two together, we go, that's it, that's the truth. And the reality is that the experience doesn't actually confirm the statement. It has some similarities to what was spoken about in the statement. And we've just said, yes, that's the truth. And at some point, we might have the thought, or someone might say, rest there, rest in the awareness, and tell me if it really confirms that it comes from source, for example, or that it really confirms that it was there before the universe or before your birth. Tell me that it really confirms that it will be there after your death. And that thinking bias, that belief that has been set in place, might feel into awareness and go, yes, it does. It definitely confirms all of that, which is unfortunately a continuation of this poor thinking that is not really present with sort of the evidence or what is, and isn't, or if it is present with what is then drawing more elaborate conclusions than are supported by what is. So I know this from personal experience. The thing that occurred to me at some point in the seeking after a lot of this knowing myself as formless awareness and I amness set in is one of the relationships or concept I had about the I am was something I was very familiar with, resting as I am for a lot of the day. And it was, what I am was never born and will never die. What I am is unchanging. What I am is ever present. And even though I have, come to see that that is not necessarily true, I will still put that forward as a teaching. So there is a video on YouTube that's called something like that, what I am was never born and will never die. As a teaching, it's very valid. So I will still put it forward, even though we need to come to the conclusion for ourselves that that's not necessarily true, but being said in order to point at something that is there. So at some point, it's like, am I sure that what I am is unchanging? Am I sure that what I am was never born and will never die? And resting, and I say, I don't know that it will be there when I die. I don't know that it was there beforehand. What I know is it is, I am, it's here now. That's undeniable. That's the undeniable. I am. I said, I don't, when I rest in it, I go, it doesn't tell me that it will always be. So I got a little concerned when that realization happened. I thought, well, it's because peace of mind was often there because of resting in I am, and the I amness had been pointed at with those descriptions about I amness. It's not the body, it's not going to be found by thinking. It is source, it is awareness, it is what you are. And so what I had found is that peace of mind was there largely in life because there was this returning home regularly, returning home when whenever suffering arose, straight away we dropped back into I am. And it was like, I am. And so much of the fear that is at the base of suffering, the fear of being attacked, the sense of being attacked, is because we have a self-image of oneself as being vulnerable. So we have a self-image of being the body that is the doer and needs outcomes. And ultimately, all of the suffering is a fear of death. So in many forms, if someone takes something, essentially it's like you're taking something away that I need to survive, even if it's an entertainment object or an object of entertainment. It's like, well, entertainment is part of who I am, and you've taken it away. So it's sort of like a mini death. And in order to calm the system down, in order to break that habit, because all of that is that suffering, where there's a fear of death, doesn't ultimately get alleviated because we don't die or because we find out we don't die. It gets alleviated because we find out that what the human being is in life is something quite unique and special. And so the fear of death gets dissolved, not because we find out that we won't die, but because we find out that I am now. And that what is important is to be here now, knowing oneself as I am alive now. And I know myself not only as alive, but as something that doesn't need the things I thought I need. That's, we realize that when we bump into this aspect of the human being that is quite special in itself. So instead of our thinking going off in an outward direction that says, I need something more special than life is at the moment, it stops doing that because it realizes how special essentially we are at our core, that each time the thinking says, I need something more special, we remember, what a silly thought, given what I am. And so we then rest back in our self and it's like, here, this is life. I don't need life to be interesting. So we'll talk more about that because that's the dropping into being and I am, which is what I want to talk about. But essentially, the fear of death, ironically, falls away, not because we realize we won't ever die. We might think that. And we might think that the fear of death and suffering has fallen away because we've bumped into this aspect of ourselves that we, for a long time, believe will never die. So which was, the case for me, because in the years leading up to, or that process of grounding into this part of the human being, this I amness, or awareness or consciousness, the I amness came with all these descriptions. They were part of the pointers, and so as I rested in there, or as there was a resting in this I am, there was still a sort of sensing it with those descriptions guiding a knowing of it. And so then there was this realization, by being honest while resting there, saying, hey, let me question some of these descriptions, some of these concepts about I am. And I found that a lot of them, other than the fact I am, and that I am complete in this moment, and I don't need circumstance to feel at peace. But a lot of the other descriptions were not confirmable. So I started to get a bit worried because I had to be honest and say, a lot of these aspects of I am that I've been holding, I'm going to have to drop. And one of the main ones, the one I'm talking about now, is I am what I am, was never born and will never die. And when we looked, having been familiar with suffering, I thought the suffering had fallen away because there's nothing to fear. There's no death to fear. So I thought, well, I can't hold on to the belief given it's not confirmable. So because one of the things that I say is that the process is about shedding beliefs, about realizing when we have a belief about something that is not confirmable, we have to drop it. And actually, suffering is based on false beliefs. So if you come across something, even if it's very valuable, like what I am was never born and never die, and I realize that's a belief because I don't have any absolute proof for it. I thought that the resting in it, and I thought it was confirming that, but it's not. When I rest there and use critical thinking, I say, it doesn't tell me where it comes from or where it will go. It just tells me I am. So anyway, I had to drop that belief. And I was a bit concerned because I thought my suffering is going to come back in again now. If that is not necessarily what I know about I am. Anyway, so because it doesn't make sense to hold a belief about something I know is not confirmable. And the great news is that the suffering didn't come back in again. And so the reassessment is, so continuous unbroken peace of mind can be there not because I always will be, but because I am now. That is the the only undeniables in life, that I am now. And so the conclusion then is that our peace is available because I am. Because I am now, not because I will be. Who cares about tomorrow? And the truth is then, if I am does die with the body, there's no one to care that death has happened. There's no one to experience death has happened. So as we investigate, we find more and more that our fear of death is a psychological fear of death in the present moment. And once the fear dissolves, what happens after death is completely wrong. In fact, it gets seen to be part of the psychology that is looking into the future, wanting certainty in the future, wanting to be, wanting to exist. And that is the sort of the nature of the psychological me that wants to continue on, wants to have a legacy, and wants to be there to enjoy life, or to enjoy something, even life after death. And by and large, that's there because of a sense of discontent in the moment. And it sort of says, I don't want to die and not exist because I feel discontent. You can't cut my life short because I don't feel complete. I don't feel like I've achieved my purpose or whatever. So that the idea of death is sort of an attack on this me that is really, even if it's not a seeker in life, all me's are seeking pleasure in life. So it might not be a spiritual seeker, but death is an affront to any human being that hasn't sort of let go of attachment to outcome, or attachment to outcome. For any human where attachment to outcome hasn't dissolved, death is the ultimate affront. It's taking away my life here where I have things to do still. And if a contentment sets in this moment, there's contentment. And the contentment is because I am, not because of circumstance. That also means that we've realized that life is an experience, and that I am that which we call I am. An aspect of that I am is awareness, and awareness experience. And we know each night experience collapses and there's no problem. Life essentially is not there and there's no problem. And so a lot of clarity comes in once there is a presence with life. And essentially the psychological identity that is afraid of not existing realizes, well, that's gone, so that fear's not there. And we know there's no problem when we're asleep. There's no one to have a problem. So life then becomes about living rather than about trying to set things up so that we can live after death. But anyway, that's an example of one of these cognitive biases, an error where a belief can get set in place because we are interpreting a component of the experience or the experience as confirming something it doesn't actually confirm, and then running with it as so we're not necessarily thinking about it all the time. In fact, if someone finds this connection to self in place, they're not thinking about stuff a lot of the time. However, if you ask them, and that's the concept that comes up in a discussion or even in a spiritual discussion or whatever, if the basic concept that comes out as to how one sees life and one sees oneself, and in that concept it says, I know myself as something that will never die. Okay, so there you go. There's the evidence that in the system of that person, there is still this false belief that isn't seen as a false belief. Because it was very useful to get to this very important place as part of the movement in their seeking. And obviously I'm talking about someone who doesn't have complete peace of mind. I suggest that complete peace of mind can't exist if we have these sort of anomalies in the system that are still sort of out of line with the end of belief. So the person I'm talking about has a strong connection with self, and suffering is probably being witnessed. When suffering is there, it's witnessed, and there's a sense, oh well, that's suffering, and it's not who I am. The suffering that's being witnessed is probably a result of some of these beliefs that are still in the system. And as those beliefs fall, the ones which are essentially beliefs because the spiritual concept has become embedded in the thumb as a new belief, as those get shed, then the suffering that is arising that was witnessed by the formless awareness and the person that I rest as that witness, and therefore the suffering is not touching who I am. So often we'll hear there is suffering, but there's no one suffering, because the subject, I, is the awareness aware of the suffering, rather than, as previously the case, involved and identified with the suffering and resisting it, and not understanding it as part of life. And so where does this resting in being play a role in seeking? Well, as I have been saying, we need to come to know ourselves more truly than we have done in the past. Before seeking happens, and during seeking, especially before some of the major dissolutions of beliefs happen, we essentially know ourselves as a person, but primarily as the physical aspect of the person, and there is a strong psychological identity embedded in the person, meaning belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome, knowing oneself essentially as a thought-based identity, without it feeling like we know ourselves as a thought-based identity, because a thought-based identity can feel very concrete and real. However, really what it is condensed belief. And so life is always experienced from the perspective of these sets of beliefs that says what I am is this and that, a concept of who I am that is quite off the mark. And anyway, even if it's off the mark, that gets defined and put in place. And then life is essentially interacted with by that belief. That's sort of like the, what are they called? Well, the greeting party to life is that psychological identity. And so when that psychological identity meets life, the experience of life is very particular. So that's how we tend to start off knowing ourselves as this human being, primarily familiar with the physical aspects of the human being. So identified with form mainly, with the part, with an aspect of the person very much in place, which is the psychological identity, which is a set of beliefs that say you need circumstance to complete you. That'll be found in the future, and you need to ensure that the other doers, the ones in control of what they're doing and that are influencing your life, act perfectly to help you to get where you need to go according to your idea of yourself and your beliefs about where happiness is. And you, as a doer, need to function perfectly to get you to where you're going. So that's the psychological identity. The spiritual seeking process gets us to understand, to know ourselves more truly. That psychological identity, you can say, is the false sense of self, not knowing ourselves. So we're living life essentially in that suit, in that costume, and experiencing life from within that costume, the costume being this psychological identity. And so all of the guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation come out of that identity bumping into life. And coming to know ourselves better essentially means coming to realize the awareness aspect of the human being that was not appreciated. It's always been there. It's always been the core of the human being. And because it's formless, because it's the background, you could say, or because the momentary experience, which is all life ever is, a momentary experience, because that is dependent on consciousness being there, it means it's always there. So it's like the air we breathe, or if you're a goldfish, what you swim, it's not something that you take any notice of because it's always there. Now it can be super important. Like imagine if the water is taken out of the goldfish pond, and the goldfish has never known life without water, the goldfish has no contrast, so it takes it for granted. But when it's gone, the goldfish realizes how important it was. But it was taken for granted. Consciousness, awareness, is like that. There can't be life, the experience of life, without consciousness, without awareness functioning through the human being. And all humans have that functioning through them. And yet, because it's always there, it's not recognized. And so spiritual teaching is saying, hey, this is a tragedy. It's a travesty that humans are going through life and not knowing themselves fully, not knowing that aspect of themselves that is so fundamental and important. Take that away and there is no human life. There is no life experience. And the majority of human beings will die unfamiliar with their own consciousness. They might have a notion of consciousness. Like if someone says, if you go and speak to, someone who's just averagely intelligent, such that they've heard the word consciousness used in English language or whatever language they speak, and you ask someone like, are you conscious? They say, well, yes, but without necessarily knowing what that is experientially, without having direct contact with the consciousness that we are. And so when you think about it, to die unfamiliar with this essential essence of yourself is a tragedy. That's what the teachings are essentially saying, and saying life is suffering when you don't know this aspect of yourself. And so they're saying you have to come to know yourself truly if life is going to cease being suffering. And there's some very compelling statements and words that will resonate deeply with us in relation to, you know, how a teaching will point at and encourage and motivate a seeker by talking about truth, reality, the absolute, what you really are, as opposed to ignorance, not knowing yourself, suffering being a result, life being an illusion, being lost in Maya. And because we have a certain uncomfortableness because of not knowing ourselves truly, because essentially we are trying to fit, it's like fitting five fingers into a two-fingered glove. It's uncomfortable, it doesn't fit properly. So in not knowing ourselves, there's this uncomfortableness in life. And so we hear this and we go, yes, this is for me, truth and reality, and life doesn't have to be like that, uncomfortable and suffering. And so that's how we find ourselves motivated and moving towards knowing this aspect. And often in the teachings, it doesn't talk about it as an aspect of oneself. It says, you are consciousness. You are not the body, right? Remember, as I said, in order for an awakening to that, it's like you're pointing at, if you're trying to tell the fish, right, about water, it's a bit of a tricky job. And so maybe you have to tell the fish some things, assuming a fish can understand what you're saying, some things about itself that are not exactly true in order to bring about a movement where the fish recognizes the water. Anyway, that's an analogy. It might not be perfect. So where does this, so I really encourage, in fact, I don't need to encourage it because I know that I know how the spiritual seeking landscape is. And when we're a seeker, we will get driven by these internal feelings. There's so many different internal feelings, including uncomfortableness, that will force us to go looking on the internet for different teachings, and things will pop up as they're needed in a sense. And we will be exposed to a broad array of teachings. And so I have faith, it's almost a given that people in the non-dual seeking path, on the non-dual seeking path, will be exposed to the esoteric top-down teachings. And so I encourage, it's great when someone has gone through those teachings and has had shifts and awakenings, because that's part of the job done. And then it's about refining and correcting some of the ideas that are in place that might not be realized, and helping an appreciation or an integration of what has been realized come back down to daily living, because the esoteric teachings, which focus sort of coming from the top down, and therefore not really talking about daily living very much, can leave a seeker unequipped, in a sense, to understand the causal level of life and the causal dynamics. So an integrating of that understanding can happen once someone has gone through that that path. And sometimes the the suffering and the psychological identity is structured a certain way that only those teachings are what is needed for some people. Or not only, but those teachings are what is going to crack the psychological identity open. And that doesn't have to be the case. You can come through a teaching that doesn't emphasize you are awareness and you're not the body as emphatically as some top-down teaching. So when I talk about top-down teachings, that's a teaching that will point at what you are as not related to daily living. So daily living is the bottom, the concrete, the causal, and a top-down approach sort of is talking about the bigger picture and looking at causality behind space is not real, essentially. So they're really pointing at what you are is up here. And a bottom-up teaching will start with daily living and point upwards. And the other starts up here and points downwards. Essentially, both of them need to integrate both the top and the bottom. It's just the top-down teaching will start from there and work down, and a bottom-up will start from here and work up. In the end, they both have to integrate the top and the bottom. So some people don't need the what can be quite extreme top-down approaches, and some do. I happen to go through the top-down approach, and because my experience was like that, I say, well, without that, things wouldn't have happened the way they happened. I don't want to go as far as saying everyone has to go through that, because I know people who haven't gone through that. And I can appreciate that what those top-down teachings do can be done in different ways. The things that get undone can be undone in different ways, in ways by introducing certain exercises and investigations that investigate what needs to be investigated, but with less extremism. So what I mean by extremism is in some of the teachings, there will be insistence of you are not the body, for example. And life is not real. Life is an illusion. Life is an appearance, and there's no reality to it. And so in a way, it's sort of a bit extreme. And someone goes, that's not extreme, that's the truth. And I said, well, I don't think it's the truth. I think it's one way of looking at life. And what it is for sure is it's a very valid teaching process, teaching methodology. Part of becoming really grounded in this awareness component or beingness component, they're not completely interchangeable. They're two aspects of consciousness, awareness and being. And when the process is revealing the awareness component of consciousness, there is a certain exploration that takes place and certain set of pointers. And when it's revealing the being aspect of consciousness, some other emphases need to be made. And the awareness aspect of consciousness feels quite different to the beingness aspect of consciousness until they merge together, become one thing, and then dissolve. They then fall away. And that's the strange thing, because often we become convinced. And so now we're getting to the crux of the talk. We become convinced that peace of mind is resting in being, that they are the same thing. And it's not really. Besides which, in some teachings don't talk about peace of mind. They just talk about knowing oneself. And so we can become even more convinced that it's all about resting in being or resting as awareness. And there's a qualitative difference. Being tends to be more embodied, tends to be more grounded. And resting as awareness, when the state is resting as awareness, it feels much emptier and formless and not located anywhere. Less grounded and more transcendent. So those are two aspects of consciousness. And very often I see people talking about I am when, based on what they describe their experience as, the experience is much more of knowing oneself as awareness. And if that's the case and someone thinks that I amness and awareness are interchangeable and the same thing, they're very related, but they're not really the same thing. I amness, beingness, isness, as I said, much more grounded. And it's an aspect of consciousness. And it feels quite different to the spacious emptiness, the transcendent, transcendent awareness sense. One of them, you could say, is more closely related to the heart chakra or the heart center, and the other more closely related to the third eye center. The awareness is, I would say, more of a functioning of the human from the perspective of that third eye center that sees big picture, more on the transcendent side of the human being, and is much less form oriented. The heart chakra, where being tends to be, is not quite it's not the lower, it's the integration of the two halves of the human, the descendant and the transcendent, or the ascendant. And the heart is the meeting point. The heart center is where I would say consciousness links into the body-mind organism. And if we find ourselves in the heart center, that tends to be where the being aspect of consciousness is felt, and the being aspect of the human being. So what role does this play? Because it actually sort of takes center stage in seeking. It's what's focused on. And so that's why we might end up concluding it's all about resting in being. It's about knowing myself as beingness. And I would say, well, yes, for a large part, that's what the seeking is about. My experience is that even beingness tends to fade away. That beingness is particularly important when suffering is still in the system. Beingness is particularly important as a place to rest outside of suffering. Being important because for a large phase of the seeking, the contrast of being in the mind and living through the psychological identity and then dropping into being actually has a quality that is maybe what feels like love or joy, or what we really are, our essence as there's a quality to being which is sort of sweet. It's not a strong it can become very strong and overwhelming. There are lots of aspects of the non-physical parts of the human being that can erupt, and we're not very familiar with them, and so they can feel very intense, and they can feel quite pleasurable. In its subtle form of being, when I refer to peace of mind as the absence of suffering, which is what I believe is an accurate description, peace of mind is not the gaining of anything, but the absence of suffering. Often that won't really completely resonate with someone, especially if that someone is resting in being a lot, because they say, well, yes, there's peace of mind, but I wouldn't describe peace of mind as the absence of suffering, because there's this presence, this sense of aliveness, of being, and there is almost like a feeling of peace and relaxation, almost like an eminence, a small eminence, causeless joy or causeless satisfaction, contentment. So all of these words imply something. And it's not that they imply it, but there is nothing. There is a sense, a feeling, a very sort of out of this world, but not extreme feeling of something in being. And that quality is, I feel, very important in order for us to feel like, yes, this is what it's all about. So when we drop out of suffering, so the thinking mind is going and there's uncomfortableness, and then we remember I am, and we drop back into this aspect of the human being that hopefully has become familiar with us, but then we need to keep returning there over and over and over again, many times in the day, until it becomes a natural place that we can know ourselves as. That sweetness is important for us to go, of course, that's why I don't need anything out there, because of what I am here. And there's an encouragement that each time we find ourselves suffering, we realize, that's because you've forgotten yourself. You've forgotten what you are, the beingness of yourself. And so we drop back there, and it's like a little smile can come to our face, and it's like, here we are. And so knowing yourself as that, and is a movement that essentially is cutting off suffering, is undoing the habit, is breaking the habit, is atrophying the psychological self that previously was getting so much attention and so much energy fed into it, because every time the blame happened, the blame would carry on, and the shame and the anxiety, and we'd try and fix it and talk to people about it as if it's real and the problem and needs a solution. And so when we're functioning that way, it's a feedback loop reinforcing the psychological identity that is turning into these feelings. And at a certain point, that movement gets seen to be suffering and the error and the not knowing oneself. And so we drop into being. And now we're essentially unplugging the electricity, the power, from strengthening the psychological self by us dropping into being. So it's almost like if you're a recovering alcoholic and you're about to have a drink, and you remember, call your friend. So call a friend and they talk you down from the drink. And so dropping into being is like not going into reinforcing the habit, and eventually the habit dies. So when the suffering keeps arising, we keep dropping into being. And it's at that phase of seeking that we tend to lose interest in the external world. We tend to lose interest in our friends. We might even feel ourselves either completely satisfied with just being, and we might find that becomes about just sitting and meditating and walking in the bush, in the forest, and just being in cafes or watching life go past and not being particularly productive. And there's this quality I was talking to you about that feels like, yes, this is it. This is what I've been missing my whole life, is to just know myself fully and understand this and know this, feel this content, this full, this whole, this needing nothing, this abundant self. Once the suffering has fallen away, the resting in being becomes less relevant. It in itself can be seen to be a bit of an obsession. We might find that at a certain phase, in that phase, it's almost like we have to keep going back there, and it becomes an effort, and it's maybe unsustainable. And that's because it's not needed to be sustainable. But at the same time, we might be thinking, but liberation is about resting there, living from there as beingness or awareness. Whether it's beingness or formless awareness, they're different. They have different feelings, but they're essentially the same. It's the same. If you're resting as being or resting as awareness, you're resting as a component of aspect of the person. And that is not where we're meant to live from. But it's very, very important in the process as a place to rest outside of suffering. It's the place when suffering gets cut off, we drop back there. And as long as suffering keeps arising, because there's still remnants in the system, it will feel like dropping into being is the solution. And it is the solution. It's knowing, it's having found that aspect of the human being that doesn't suffer, and doesn't need to go seeking and doesn't need to get stuff, because it feels quite happy resting there. So where am I going with this? I'm going to the point where when the suffering stops continuously arising, we stop needing to rest in being. And so why is that the case? Because now we have the motivation to just get back to living, to get back to doing sort of fairly ordinary, mundane things as a human being. It might be work, it might be hobbies, it might be meeting up with friends. But now we find we're living life free of suffering, not because we're resting in being, but because the suffering dynamic has been uprooted. The false sense of self has been uprooted. So now we don't need to know ourselves as just that aspect of the human being, which for a while we might not have looked at as an aspect. We might have looked at as that's what I am. And my suggestion is life is taking us to a place of integrated living as a human being, free of suffering. And that means knowing myself as a human being, as a person that knows that the human being has all of these layers. It has the awareness and the being layers or dimensions, aspects. It has the physical, it has thinking, but now not the thinking mind thinking, just the working mind thinking. It has emotions, it has biological preferences, it's in the flow of life. And so all of these things are now clearly known. there isn't an idea that life is seeking is about transcending life or even getting to know oneself anymore, because that's happened, let's say. And so life then moves you back into life, doing ordinary things as a person, having very much your shortcomings still, quirks in your personality, having your skills and your positive sides, not being perfect and not having perfect control over outcomes. Still, you might follow your intuition, but you realize your intuition is not infallible. You might make decisions from a different place, not from shoulds and shouldn'ts, and you still see some of those decisions don't turn out well. Um, the significant thing is that the suffering isn't arising. And so then this connection to being is not so important in its pronounced sense. We'll still be connected to being because we know ourselves fully. We know ourselves as an integrated human, which means definitely aware of awareness, but not resting only in that awareness dimension. When you rest exclusively or very much in that one layer of the human being, then life is experienced a certain way, and the sense of self is, oh, I am that layer of the human being. So if you're resting in the awareness layer, that's essentially not integrated. That's not living as the human that has all the layers stacked together as a single human being. That deconstructing the human down into layers means we end up identifying with some of the layers more than others. And then we rest essentially in that layer of the human being, which is sort of like hanging out in one room in the house. And a certain room has a certain view and a certain feel to it. And a layer of the human has a certain feel to it. And then the experience of life has a certain quality when lived from that perspective. And as I said, that can be very useful, but essentially in the end, life is going to move us to living as an integrated human, which means sort of being in all rooms of the house, using the house fully. And when you're in one room, you know the other rooms are there and you're familiar with them, even if you're not in it. And so obviously the room you're in at a particular time, there's more of that aspect. But there's also a knowing of the whole house. And that can happen still. We can drop into those layers of the human being. It's like going to visit a room. So meditation often, if it's a closed eye meditation, is dropping into the quantum dimension of the human and having that experience, that resting there, recharging, or getting a sense of that part of who I am. And then we can come back out of meditation and not lose touch with that, but it's not the primary, it's not infusing, it's infusing the experience, but not in a way where it's overpowering the other aspects of the human experience. So this beingness is something we're often not connected to because of the power of thought. Thinking has a very strong power of not allowing us to know that this dimension is available. And so a lot of the teachings will, for a while, encourage the end of thinking, which is not a sustainable thing. And yet it will be delivered in some teachings as what liberation is. Liberation is the end of thinking. It isn't. Liberation is the end of psychological suffering, which is a specific type of thinking. And that's why those teachings say it's the end of thinking, because they're encouraging the end of all thinking for a while, which is a way of uprooting the psychological suffering thinking. So I guess I'm saying that there are different jobs along the way, and dropping into being is the refuge, essentially. So if we find ourselves suffering and thinking about the past and the future and blaming and feeling anxiety, we can't think our way out of that. You can't expect the end of suffering to come when we're addressing suffering with more suffering, which can be the only way we know how to do it until this other dimension is available. And so that's why the teachings will say, your true nature is outside of thought. You'll never find it in thinking. So stop thinking. So there will be an encouragement that says go out into life without thinking, which means stop labeling everything, stop believing concepts that say this happened because of that. That's not how life is. Well, that's what the concepts in that teaching will. It's like saying, for as long as you go out thinking you're a person, thinking that this led to that, thinking that life is real, that form is really form, and labeling everything according to all the rules that society have given you about what's what, you're going to remain lost. So you have to go out and be innocent, and innocent means allow everything to be fresh and interact with life from a place of feeling, from the body, where you are connected to life. You have to feel it. Don't think about it. And don't feel it and then think about it. And don't think you can feel it by thinking about it. In fact, just realize that you label everything, that you have stories about what this person did and what you did and what's good and what's bad for you, what you need, why things happen, where the came from. Don't believe science. Don't believe spirituality. Don't believe anything. All of that's concepts. And that's great. Like really, I think that those finding oneself, if a seeker finds themselves drawn to that and resonating with it, you might become a bit nutty. Actually, that part of the process is sort of prone to making you a bit extreme in your view about life, where you essentially convinced everyone is deluded, and now you see life as it is, which is not real, and there's a truth to that, but the reality is that we probably have swung too much to the other side. But it opens up so much by breaking our conditioned way of seeing life. So the teachings that talk about the esoteric nature of life, that none of this is real, that there is no such thing as a tree or a stone or a mountain or a river. All of that form is just apparent and it doesn't exist. That time and space and causality doesn't exist, that the human being doesn't exist, that none of this is real. All of this is a dream and an illusion. They're really wonderful to go out and to really consider, is this all unreal? Is it all illusion? Is it true that there is no form, that even that which feels like form is just an experience form? That that's magical, because we then actually start to feel like we might be living in science fiction. And not science fiction as if it is fiction, but rather science fiction as if it's reality. Like science fiction is the reality and we just haven't seen it. And that's bound to open up boundaries and get us thinking outside of the box. And yeah. In summing all of that up, so as not to just leave it hanging, life is pretty much very different to our perception of it. There is some truth to none of this being real other than an appearance. There is some truth to it having at least there's at the same time as that, there's some truth to it being real. At least we need to live it as if it's real. You might say that the brick isn't real, but the truth is, if it gets thrown at your head, it is going to hurt and kill you or injure you. So on one level, it's real. And then, and also from another, we see the brick and the whole world collapses with my awareness. When awareness collapses, none of it's there. So there is an angle from which we can say there is just the momentary experience spontaneously arising, and you don't exist outside of that experience. And the experience doesn't exist without you. And therefore, the universe in practice, in experience, only exists when you are aware of it. That's not necessarily an absolute truth. The bedroom might have an independent existence outside of your awareness of it, but your experience of the bedroom doesn't, that's for sure. Anyway, life is different to how we imagine it. In practical terms, the most significant thing that we see incorrectly is how we know ourselves. We essentially know ourselves as a human being and believe that we have to find happiness in circumstance, that it's not available now, it will be maybe available in the future. We see ourselves as the one orchestrating the speaking and the thinking, whereas in fact all of that is happening. The thinking arises, then there is awareness of it. The thinking is produced by the biological instrument, by the brain, which is part of the biological instrument. And the brain is a very complex thing that we can say is part of what I am. It is part of the person, and I am the person. But that part of the person functions automatically, as do so many other parts of the person. And yet we have the experience of being this person. And in practical terms, we have to live as the person. There is the aware of the outputs of the person, which we can call my speaking, but understand that my speaking is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, the complex biological instrument, which I am. So the paradox is I'm speaking, and yet from another perspective, the speaking is not my doing, but it is my doing because the machinery doing the speaking is what I am, but that machinery can only function one way. So as I see it, as I live it, the understanding is I am the person, but I'm not the one in control of how my life turns out. And yet in each moment I have to turn up, I have to do my best, even if my best is not very good sometimes, that's my best. So do your best in each moment. Understand the outcome is not in your control. However, your actions are going to be part of the outcome and linked to the outcome. But those actions are not in your control. So there's the paradox. What I do is not in my control. The outcome of what I do is not in my control. However, in the moment, I have complete free will to do exactly what I think or feel to do, which is really God's will unfolding as my free will. Why is it God's will as my free will? Why are they not two? Because really, whatever happens is not my doing, and yet it happens through me with the sense that I'm doing it. And that's great. If the attitude matches that, we get the best of both worlds. We get to live as if I'm the doer. We get to live as if I'm a human being, knowing that everything that happens is God's will. Knowing that the human being's happiness, meaning peace of mind, is not dependent on outcomes, but based on the attitude to outcomes. And knowing, hopefully from experience, that that attitude to outcomes can change such that there is peace of mind. And if that has changed, we know that I didn't make that happen, but rather I got ushered through life, like going through a car wash, and the water droplets were hitting me. The new conditioning was hitting me and was being processed by the body-mind organism in such a way that the right changes happened. And that's everyone's birthright. Birthright of peace of mind, meaning everyone is entitled to peace of mind. Like if you are born in the lineage of a king, it's your birthright to be king. Now, you might never become king, but it is your birthright to be king. Circumstance might not conspire for you to become king. You might die before your predecessor dies. And so you may never become king, but it is your birthright to be king. And once again, it's an analogy, it's not perfect. It's your birthright to be at peace. You're not missing anything. As a human being, you don't have anything missing that says, oh, I'm sorry. Unfortunately for you, you're not entitled to peace of mind. Now, things can prevent us from our birthright. We can say it's the birthright of human beings to be free. And yet other human beings can prevent a human being from being free, can capture and enslave someone. And yet it's still their birthright to be free. So if the obstacles are overcome, then it's available. The thing is that we don't control whether the obstacles are overcome. The reason for saying it's everyone's birthright is for, and what it really means is that no one is missing anything that is needed for peace of mind. The problem is we have too much other stuff that isn't needed. So it's really about shedding that which is not needed. And the shedding is not something we do. It's a process that happens or it doesn't happen. That's destiny unfolding. So it's everyone's birthright, which means no reason it can't happen, except the shedding doesn't happen. Consciousness is present in everyone. The fact that my hand is raised and there is awareness, the capacity to be aware of my hand, means consciousness is functioning through you. And consciousness is the essence of the human. If we can rest in consciousness, we find, here I don't need to be thinking about the past or the future. And here I feel content. Here I feel complete. Here I feel at peace. So that's liberation, according to this teaching, the end of suffering. Continuous, unbroken peace of mind, irrespective of the pleasure or pain of circumstance. It's dependent on our attitude to circumstance and not circumstance itself. Okay, let's see if we have a question or two. Hello, Holger.
Hello, Roger. Thank you for your teaching, and maybe one day we go back to the good old times where you, in the beginning of the satsang, just repeat the teaching.
Yes, I'll do that tomorrow.
Good. And then it's interesting that you mention God once in a while. God's will be done. And if we are not clear about our own identity, then we just project into God. I mean, we see God as the same as we believe ourselves to be, like a person, maybe.
Correct.
But if you look at God as the cause of the phenomena of life, impersonal, then God's will be done. There's another part in the Bible where it says, as in heaven, so on earth. So it's not just God by himself, whatever God is. It's a relationship between heaven and earth that it's like a cookie machine in a way that that spits out experience based on our identity. And cause and effect is just important to me. I mean, I always have trouble when you use the word person. It feels so confusing that because to me, person, the origin of the word just means mask. So to me, it's just an effect. It's not the cause why things happen. And if you identify yourself with the effect, saying I am the person, then kind of you shoot yourself in your own foot in a way, it feels to me. And there I see your true. Please, sorry, I listen.
Well, I was going to say, so what should we, or what can we identify with, if not the person?
I am.
But I'm suggesting that I am is the essence of the person, is the core of the person. So in knowing yourself as the person, you must know yourself as I am. So by saying I am the person, I'm not saying you are not I am. I'm saying the person is in essence I am, with the body and all of the other aspects of the person closed around the core of I amness.
Yes, the invisible being. Now, and tricky to put it into words. I mean, first of all, I love your teaching, and it's beautiful, and it's nice that you kind of push my buttons in certain areas because it makes me look closer. And yes, this idea today that maybe I'm just stuck with my idea of faceless, formless awareness. And it's just good. It's all just a wake-up call. I like this analogy of being a car wash, and this is great. It's like, maybe I don't need the extra shine. Maybe, I mean, do you see a difference between individualized consciousness and the genes and up-to-date conditioning? I mean, individualized consciousness being as the invisible aspect of our true nature. And then in the appearance, in our experience, we have the genes and up-to-date conditioning, which is just on the effect level. And so if we never are aware of the cause, or if we don't entertain the right cause, then the effect, the person, can never be in alignment with our true nature.
Individual consciousness, to me, what I would call personal consciousness, is the only thing we have access to. And it is, to me, personal consciousness is what we are experiencing. The world as we experience it in each moment is our personal consciousness experience. That's the way I use the word personal consciousness. And the only reason that we have a personal consciousness experience, which means life known from a particular perspective, the only reason we have a personal consciousness experience is because, in theory, the impersonal consciousness of Source, the impersonal consciousness of Source is linked to this particular body-mind instrument and is then functioning through the instrument as personal consciousness. However, the personal consciousness is the after effect, is what is there after the impersonal consciousness has traveled through the instrument and picked up all of the characteristics, including the capacity to be aware of be aware through that instrument. So actually, the awareness is part of the impersonal consciousness of Source. However, it needs an instrument through which to see. It needs a portal, and the portal is the instrument. When the impersonal consciousness goes through that portal, what it sees is the personal consciousness experience. And the best way I can describe it is, if you have white light, which we say is the impersonal consciousness of Source, and a red piece of plastic, and it then goes, the white light, the impersonal consciousness of Source, goes through the red filter, which is the equivalent of the instrument, the body-mind organism. And what comes out the other side is red light. And we know that the red light is essentially both the white light and the red filter, and the output is the red light. And you can't have the red light if you take away the body-mind organism. You can't have the red light. If you take away the white light, you can't have the red light. And in this theory, you can't take away the red light and the red lens and still have the white light. They are all interdependent on each other. And so what we know as life from Roger's perspective, life from Holger's perspective, to me is personal consciousness experience, the personal consciousness experience. And that experience, the personal consciousness experience, is infused with the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So I don't see the genes and up-to-date conditioning as separate or the cause of the personal consciousness experience. They are spontaneous with the personal consciousness experience. Does that work?
I don't know. And this is so beautiful just to say I don't know, because there's so much freedom in I don't know. It was just clear to me that thinking is already past. Whenever I have a thought, it's already over on one level. I mean, it's so in this regard, I'm more comfortable with being, instead to be just entertained endlessly with things from the past. And I totally like your practicality, because otherwise I'm just in the bubble of my own thinking, totally unrelated. So life is really beautiful, and I'm just interested in the connection between my attitude and the change in circumstances, because I still have a preference for certain circumstances. And like when you pray, believe that you have received already and it will be given to you. Or this other thing, ask in my name, which to me is I am, awareness. This is just fascinating to me. I mean, because life is beautiful and it's really not limited to what I can understand and believe. I mean, but I don't always feel like in an exuberant state, or where it's just very often I feel maybe like gray inside or a little sticky, and but discovering where my suffering comes from, and so maybe that's the most important part of your teaching. What I learned from you is just to acknowledge my own suffering and to become aware of it, because without it, without understanding the mechanism of the suffering and my false identity, I never can really be myself, because there's always this slime over me, which just prevents me just to sparkle in my own color.
Indeed. I like that. That's a very nice way of putting it.
Yeah. So, yeah. You're frozen right now. Are you still there? Okay, I think we got disconnected. One, two.
It seems like we had a connection issue. Sorry, Holger, we dropped out for a second.
Perfect. We are totally in sync, and I really thank you. And I see that there are two other people in the line. Thank you so much, Roger.
Thank you, Holger. Sorry, the internet dropped out.
No problem. No problem. Bye-bye.
See you, Holger. Bye. Marianne? Hello, Marianne.
Hi, Roger. Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you so much.
Yes, we just had. Oh, you're welcome.
Your teaching really stopped me, and I'm not interested in enlightenment or anything like that. I want to stop my suffering, and it's amazing. So my question is, when my worry comes up, my constant anxiety, I can see it differently. My investment in outcomes, and I can shift a bit in viewing it. One thought that keeps coming up though is, even if you drop back into being and you could see that this is your investment in outcomes, this will keep happening in time. It will keep coming up. And I guess my question is that just part of it, this fascination with time? Oh, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So whether it keeps happening or not, we don't know. It can keep happening. So, if you drop into being, you might find that the anxiety actually is still there, or it keeps happening. And the whole point here is to see that life, the whole of life, meaning our personal consciousness experience from one moment to the other, is what we are aware of. It's the experience that is there that we are aware of, and we want it to be a certain experience. So we say, I don't want to experience this. And life is saying, yeah, but this is what I've created for you to experience. And part of our attitude says, well, thank you very much, but I would like something else. I'm going to pick another movie for today. And, that's just not how life operates. And so for as long as that's the attitude, I'll have another movie for today, thanks, then where that attitude is in resistance to the movie that life has picked. And even if it changes, we might think, oh, I got it to change because I decided, I was in resistance and it changed. But it changed because that was the experience that life had for you, not because you made it change. So this surrender essentially is a surrender to the fact, oh, my experience is what my experience is.
Yes, very clear. Thank you. I get where the disjointedness was. I see it.
Great.
Thank you.
So, yeah, you're welcome. So in summary, that's a reminder that it can seem completely unappealing to hear what I've just described. That is basically life is an experience unfolding. And the problem is that we are in resistance to the experience unfolding. And if the experience is suffering, then we can't control it. We can't make it stop and become peace of mind. And yet, in that experience, we are forced often to resist the experience. And liberation, even though it doesn't sound like that is liberation, is coming to accept, to see that the experience is what it is. And ironically, maybe we find that the experience changes from being an uncomfortable experience to an experience, but actually it's not to be set up. If I say that it can change from being an uncomfortable experience to an experience of peace of mind, then when suffering is there, the doer is going to say, okay, but I know it can be peace of mind because Roger described it. We seem to miss the fact that what needs to precede it is a surrender of the experience as it is right now. And that surrender can't be a pretend surrender, like, okay, I'm surrendering, but really we're surrendering in order to get peace of mind. Because that's not surrender. Surrender is where you surrender to the fact that this moment is suffering, that this moment is destined to be suffering if it's suffering, and that might be there for the rest of one's life. That is surrender. And then life carries on. And so the truth is that even if we accept that it might be like that for the rest of our life, the fact is life is then going to unfold. Spiritual teachings have been reminding us that it tends to unfold with less suffering when surrender truly happens. So I'll leave you with that note, on that note, and see you next time. Peace.